Sono lecturer in Italian Studies alla University of Kent con Lorenzo Chiesa, Marco Chiesa e altre persone non presenti. No, nessun problema, anzi, grazie. Sarò breve, anzi brevissimo. Come si suol dire, ho finito. No. Ho preparato questo paper in inglese, poi l'ho tagliato copiosamente, quindi se vedete tante pagine in realtà andrò molto veloce. No, non lo faccio in inglese. Laura, capisci? Benissimo. Ok. No, non c'è perché è troppo tagliato. Questa comunicazione va pensata, credo, come un addendum più che altro al primo panel, penso. Non c'entra proprio niente con questo panel. Mi scuso di questo, vi trascino un attimo fuori dal politico, Laura me ne vorrà un po' per questo, ma più che un addendum al primo panel, addirittura io direi una glossa all'introduzione che Laura stessa ha fatto a questa conferenza. Quello che vorrei fare è cercare, insomma, di dare un minimo brevissimo, per l'appunto, contributo a fornire una risposta alla domanda: cosa può contribuire la psicanalisi alla questione biopolitica, sia dal punto di vista di paradigma interpretativo che di situazione politica in un certo senso. Per fare ciò vorrei articolare la questione della soggettività in Lacan con la proposta affermativa di biopolitica affermativa che fa Roberto Esposito, che trovo molto efficace per certi versi, che è stata ed è tuttora molto influente all'estero, ma che soffre di un problema fondamentale che Tarizio, sto parlando tra l'altro in italiano, che Davide Tarizio esprime molto bene, e ora inizio in inglese perché l'ho tradotto. As Davide puts it, in fact, Esposito tries to substitute the semantics of life to that of subjectivity, reducing the subject to a mere effect of something, that is to say, life, which always precedes it and of which the subject would only be an epiphenomenon. But the more we venture on this road, and the more we fall into metaphysics of life, he says. That is to say, from the ontological consideration that gestation and birth metaphorically epitomize the perfect balance and permeability of Communitas and Immunitas, Esposito concludes that, and here he is implicitly overlapping birth and the munus, the gift that cannot be not given, on an ethical plane, well, birth cannot be not given. Articulating Esposito's paradigm of immunization with the Lacanian notion of subjectivity might ultimately redeem, so to say, Esposito's affirmative biopolitics from the biopolitical dead end to which he comes when he sanctions the obligation of birth, as Chiesa calls it. And by shifting the focus from the life hypothesis of the fetus to a living life, to a subjectivized life, if you will, I believe it is possible to rephrase Esposito's ontoethical obligation of birth, the art protection of a transcendental life impotence, into an ethical obligation of care, of protection of an immanent and subjectivized life. So I don't think I need to refer to Esposito's paradigm of immunization in its entirety. Suffice it to recall the main point, that is to say that he starts from the idea that Communitas, from the etymology of Communitas, which is composed of cum, that which is not one's own, he says, and munus, the gift that is given, because it must be given and it cannot be not given. The munus is the gift of an initial property, he says, which is subjectivity. Immunitas, on the other hand, can be either thought as an original autonomy, he says, or as a subsequent exemption from a previously incurred debt, but also, drawing on biomedical language, immunitas indicates a condition of resistance of the organism towards the risk of contracting an illness. And this acceptation, it is clear that there is no Communitas without a certain amount of Immunitas, and the condition of affirmative biopolitics is to summarize very much, is a porous condition of balance between Immunitas and Communitas. On the contrary, a condition of thanatopolitics, of a ruthless exertion of biopower, is when, he says, immunization, which is necessary to protect life, is brought beyond a certain threshold. Now, according to Esposito, gestation, pregnancy, and birth epitomize the porous balance between Communitas and Immunitas, the ideal state in which immunization and community permeate each other, and immunity serves as a protection to the community and not to its dispersion. And here I will just give one brief quote. Birth constitutes the original point in which Immunitas is one and the same with Communitas. The newborn is the singular, but also infinitely plural, bearer of the munus. Yet, for these very reasons, Esposito reaches ominous conclusions, eventually sanctioning the sacredness of prenatal life, and, as Chiesa contends, suggesting that the acknowledgement of biological birth as a binding gift is the ultimately blessed communitarian dimension of man. And this is so because birth and the ontological obligation it carries with it directly issue from the force of life itself, our protection of a life that is otherwise as yet unprotected. So, is it possible to redeem Esposito's otherwise effective paradigm from such a vitalistic drift? That is to say, it is possible ultimately to think biopolitics affirmatively without necessarily regarding life as blessed and birth as an ontological obligation? I think what is at stake here is to think the subject almost as a conceptual bridge between bare life and the political sphere, and to do so, I think it is necessary, or at the very least convenient, to look at Lacan's theory. Why so? Well, we've been discussing this quite thoroughly throughout these days, but let me give you my opinion. Well, because the whole process of the ontogenisis of the subject is set into motion, according to Lacan, because man is born biologically premature. And here the Balkan biology comes on the stage. And because of this initial lack in adequacy, the human being is caught up in an alienating relationship with his own body image first, and then with the other, from which he or she will never recover. In other words, this initial lack constitutes the subject quite secondary to the subjectivity. Now, in Seminar 11, Lacan spells out this ontogenesis by using three operations, he calls them: alienation, aphanesis, which translates as fading, disappearance, and separation. Here I will quote in passing some parts of Seminar 11 that through alienation in language, the first moment of the ontogenesis of the subject appears only in the other, he says, insofar as the first signifier emerges in the field of the other and represents the subject for another signifier. The signifier manifests the subject to the other, but in doing so, it also reduces, quoting again, the subject in question to being no more than a signifier. Alienation, that is, condemns the subject to appearing on the one side as meaning produced by the signifier, on the other as aphanesis. The very famous example, a mugger attacks a person and explains, your money or your life. If one chooses money, one dies, thus losing both life and money. If one chooses to live, one chooses a deprived life, a life deprived of money. Being and meaning, to be and to be a signifier in the field of the other, are in the same logical relationship as money and life. In coming into being as a subject, one loses being. In order to mean, to become a signifier in the field of the other. If one were to choose being instead of meaning, one would cease to exist. Thus, this is a paradoxically forced choice, Lacan says. This is the inaugural operation of the subject as Mank want to be lack of being. A third element, of course, must enter the stage before the advent of the non-psychotic subject. It is the name of the father, the function that affects the separation from the very complicated relationship between the child and the mother. Separation is that by which, says Lacan, the subject finds the return way of the veil of alienation, by which the subject finds, one might say, the weak point in the primal diad of the signifying articulation. In separation, the subject finds that the other is also lacking, that the other is also desiring, that the subject is the object of the other's desire, and thus that the subject can be lacking to the other, that the subject can fade, aphanesis, from the field of the other. The subject thus eventually lodges his own mancaetra at the level of the signifying chain, the lack of the other and the lack of the subject overlap. Separare, to defend oneself from the other, and separere, to engender oneself, says Lacan. Very bluntly put, with alienation, the subject avoids hallucinating the feeling of his own mank, of his own lack, in an idyllic, primeval, imaginary wholeness. With separation, on the contrary, the subject avoids the opposite, to protect oneself from the aphanesis of being in a complete fusion into the all-caring other. Neither solipsism nor return to the womb can in fact fill the mank, the lack. Nothing can. The subject comes into being as a desiring subject. That might be said to be the ethics of desire. You cannot avoid facing your own aphanesis, and you are only allowed to try to unsuccessfully overcome it by desiring. In other words, you are only with and within the other. And now to move towards my conclusion, Lacan's theory finds a point of entrance in expositor theory explicitly in his recent review of Recalcati's latest book on Jacques Lacan. From this review we can start to make a couple of correspondences, for instance, between Communitas and the intersubjectivity and the symbolic, the other. Understood, says Esposito, as a request of reciprocal recognition as the laws of speech and gift. Entering this Communitas requires a munus, a gift that is given because it cannot be not given. Entrance in the intersubjective communitarian relationship into the symbolic order requires the fading of being. Subjects come into being as lacking being itself, they come into being as relational signposts for the other. This entails a munus, the aphanesis of being that produces the subject as mancaetra. The subject comes into being qua alienation in the other, but its ontogenesis is not complete until a certain distance, a gap, without which anything could be there, says Lacan, lodges itself between the subject and the other. In the process, complementary to alienation, that is, separation. Aphanesis cannot correspond to a total fading into the other. Aphanesis cannot be an excuse for the subject to be only the other, to embrace a complete, total, and blissful alienation. A separation must divide the two, and the ethical responsibility of the subject becomes thus to be a subject in that place where there is constant exposure to aphanesis. Separation corresponds to Immunitas, not yet as an autoimmune drift, not yet as a total exemption from the munus, but as a necessary counterpart to the dissolution into the community. Separation, and here I'm quoting Recalcati, is never a liquidation of the other, but it always implies opening onto the other. It does not erase the depth, but it assumes and not steps it, because only by assuming it we can overcome it. The subject is thus a subject exposed onto its own alterity that does not identify with itself, but neither does it loses itself in the other, says Esposito in the review. So Esposito's opening onto Lacan via Recalcati not only lets emerge the metaphysical vitalism that actually underpins his biophilosophy, but also offers an escape route from it. By reintroducing a notion of subjectivity, intrinsically tied to intersubjectivity and otherness, ontogenetically and also biologically secondary to otherness, it is no longer birth that gives the metaphorical epitome of an affirmative biopolitics, of a paradigm of balance between Communitas and Immunitas. The life that needs ontoethical protection, therefore, is no longer embodied in the fetus, but possibly in postnatal care, in caring as intersubjective relationship, profoundly grounded on a biological reality, inscribed within the paradigm of immunization and epitome of an affirmative dialectic between Immunitas and Communitas. Yet it is a processual paradigm grounded in the process of the ontogenesis of the subject rather than in the bare life that precedes it. To a certain extent, hence, the shift in the ethical consequences of assuming the Communitas-Immunitas dialectics from the obligation of birth to the obligation of care returns ethics to an intersubjective and immanent dimension whence it was somehow smuggled into the realm of transcendental prenatal course of life. Within such framework, and this is my conclusion, giving birth can no longer be considered as an epitome of the munus of the gift that is given because it cannot be not given, whence its obligation. The munus is always already at the biological center of the ontogenesis of the subject in the form of an insurmountable neotenic biological lack that sanctions more than the ontoethical obligation of birth, the ethical obligation of care. And ethical here is understood as the ethical dimension disclosed by psychoanalysis, the ethics of desire, the ethical responsibility that we have towards our own desire. And being desire always desire of the other, the psychoanalytic ethics of desire, thus, along with the lacking subject, reintroduces the responsibility we have towards each other, qua lacking and desiring subject, and not only as their lives. Thank you.